welcome to the darker side of boxing with myself, Sean Bastow, joined as always by co-host Johnston Brown, to bring you this new true crime documentary series. So this first episode that we've decided to pick is one of the most infamous incidents in boxing history. It's the mysterious life and death of Charles Sonny Liston. Johnston, the original unsolved murder, the original mystery, the life and the mysterious death of Sonny Liston.
I have really enjoyed going through this side of Sonny Liston's career. We are obviously boxing lovers. We love our boxing, and I've looked at Liston for a long time in terms of in boxing sense and looking at him as a fighter. It's been really great to look at him on the other side, the darker side of his life. And, you know, if there's anyone better to pick for our first ever episode for the darker side of boxing, it's Sonny Liston. And boy, I must say, this is just an unbelievable episode, really. I think it's just terrific that we're trying to take a slightly different route. Obviously, including in boxing, just it really does bend your mind, really, in terms of how this guy's life started and how it ended.
The format of this series is very much like a career profile, but it's more a career profile of outside of the ring incidents. So we're going to be going through the timeline of Sonny Liston's life from birth all the way up until his passing and all the notable incidents in between. Starting for Sonny Liston, I think the first thing to talk about with Sonny Liston is the fact that nobody actually knows the year he was born. There's multiple stories about whether he was born in 1927 or whether he was born in 1928 or whether he was even born on May the 8th, 1932. But nobody fully knows the date of birth of Sonny Liston.
No, it's a mystery. I mean, it is apparently what his story was. The day he was born was marked on a tree. You know, he was born on the tenant farm in Sanslow, Arkansas, in USA. But as you say, the exact date is a complete mystery. It's unknown. He was born into a sharecropping family who farmed the poor land of Moorledge Plantation near Johnston Township, St. Francis County, Arkansas. So Liston believed his date of birth was May the 8th, 1932, and he used official purpose documents that basically he was saying that was his birthday. So there were official documentations from one writer where he concluded that actually Liston was more plausible that he was born on the 22nd of July, 1930. So this is due to statements from his mother, from her lifetime. But then you have the other issue with his arrest record, because Sonny was arrested a lot, and they believe that he was either born in 1927 or 1928. So it was an interesting. I mean, he got no idea, bless him. I mean, he had a difficult upbringing, and it's literally from the beginning. He doesn't even know the day he was born, bless him.
Also, the fact that he doesn't even know when he was born. He was also born into such a large family. Sonny was actually the 24th out of 25 children in the whole Liston family on his father's side. So his father told Liston he had 16 children before he met Sonny Liston's mother Helen, and he had another 9 children with Helen, and Liston was the 8th of that 9 children with Helen. So he was the 24th out of 25 kids that his dad had actually fathered, and the relationship with his father is well documented as being a very, very poor relationship. Sonny Liston labelled his father quite simply a monster. He beat all his children up, and Sonny Liston bore a lot of the scars of his father's whippings. And when he started boxing, Sonny once said of his father, "The only thing my old man ever gave me was a beating."
He was an absolute monster, and Sonny had a difficult upbringing for the 12 to 13 years he was with his father before his mother, Helen Baskin, was her actual maiden name. Before she was married, she moved to St. Louis, Missouri. And she went there to seek factory work, and she took a couple of the siblings with her, and don't know how many. But she left Sonny. He remained in Arkansas with his father for a further year. And it wasn't until sort of 1946 that the following year, from his mother leaving, Sonny had basically had enough with the persistent beating and working long hours on the farmland. He decided he's going to leave Arkansas, and he's going to try and reunite with his mother and his siblings. Now, there's 3 separate stories to how Sonny actually got to St. Louis. So his wife, Geraldine, believed that he hitchhiked his way. Sean Assel, who is the author of Murder The Murder of Sonny Liston, and it's a great book. I'd advise anyone to read it. He stole a bag of potatoes and then sold it for a bus ticket. So there was another reason for it, another way of him getting to St. Louis. And the third was Wikipedia, and they state that he thrashed pecans from his brother-in-law's tree and sold them for travelling purposes and got to St. Louis with the proceedings. So it's interesting. Even we don't know when he was born, we don't know how he got to St. Louis, but he got there. And he was a country lad. He weren't too sure sort of what a city was like. And when he arrived in the city, I believe he felt that he naively thought he could just ask a stranger where his mother was, and they'd point him out to him. Unfortunately, he wasn't like that. He was actually greeted by the authorities, who actually helped him to find his mother. And he met up with his mother and his siblings. And from there, she sent him off to school.
When I first started, I was 13. I went to the gym and I got a shellacking, so I said, that's not for me. And so, and then again, I waited until I got 18, and I was big, and I weighed 218. So I figured, I said, well, I'm a man now, I can take it on my own.
So Sonny Liston, his background is something that is, again, well documented. And one of the things that is well documented about is the fact that he really struggled to read and to write. And this was due to the fact that his father had him working all sorts of hours, which they never give him time for any schooling. So he always struggled to read and he always struggled to write. And when he got to St. Louis with his mother, he went to the school in St. Louis. And when he got there, because of how far behind with his literacy skills he was being teased by other kids. Naturally, kids can be kids, and they will tease you for anything they can. And in this instance, they were teasing Sonny Liston for the fact that he struggled to read and he struggled to write. Now, Sonny Liston, you've seen the size of the man as an adult. He was also quite a large child as well. You know for a fact that when that man was angry, the first thing he was going to do was lash out, because that's all he knew. He knew that from his father. He knew how to beat, because his father used to beat him. And that is naturally what he would do in school. So a close friend of Sonny Liston has stated as saying he ended up leaving school because he didn't want to end up hurting any of his fellow pupils. We move into 1949 to 1950 now. And after dropping out of school, Sonny Liston found it difficult to get a full-time job. So like most young adults of that particular era who didn't have a pot to piss in, he couldn't read or write, and he was greatly uneducated. They would resort to the only one thing that could make him any money, which was a life of crime. With Liston being built like a brick shithouse, it was easy money for Liston, because everybody would be scared of him.
A young boy, uneducated, which is understandable. He's a big guy. Give me your money. You're going to hand over the money. You're not going to say no to Sonny Liston. And armed robberies. And it was actually the armed robbery that got him caught and got put inside. But, you know, he wasn't the sharpest tool in the box, Sonny. It was easy to identify, mainly because while he was mugging people, he wore a brightly coloured shirt, which is a bit of a stupid thing to do. And the police, the St. Louis police, actually labelled him as the Yellow Shirt Bandit. So eventually, wearing a bright yellow shirt, he's going to get caught. And that's what happened. And Liston finally got caught by the police in 1950 for robbing a gas station and restaurant at the age of 20, although newspapers at the time did suggest that he was 22 years old. Hence, again, the reason we still didn't quite know how old he was. And he was actually sentenced to 5 years in prison in Missouri State Penitentiary in 1950. So that's where he spent 2 years of his life, although he was sentenced to 5. And there was a reason for that, and it was because a gentleman, Reverend Alice Stevens, or Father Stevens, probably the best way to put it, he was associated with the Jefferson City Penitentiary Boxing Club, and he noticed that Liston had ability. So he decided that, in actual fact, he warmed to him, not that, as a personality, not just the fighter, but he see this guy potential. And he showed him the ropes, and he brought him into boxing, and from boxing he became a champion. And Sean Lascelles sums up Sonny Liston's start in his life in 1950 going to book quite brilliantly. And he said that most people lose their careers when they go to prison, but Sonny actually found his, and that's exactly what he did. He found boxing in prison.
Whilst he was in prison and whilst he found boxing, Sonny never actually lost a fight and quickly became the champion of the penitentiary. Now, Father Stevens, as you quite rightly mentioned there, he saw something in Sonny Liston, not just as a boxer, but the softer side to his personality, that there was a caring man inside of that big brute which was Sonny Liston. Like a lot of people in that particular era, he was just born into an unfortunate set of circumstances. So, to showcase Liston's boxing potential, he sparred with heavyweight professional Thurman Wilson and absolutely beasted him from pillar to post. And even Wilson said himself, "Better get me out of this ring, he's going to kill me." So with the help of Father Stevens, Sonny was able to be granted an early parole, but many believe that an Italian-born New York City mafia soldier named Frankie Carbo, whose name we'll be hearing a lot throughout this episode, was actually responsible for his early release. So at this early stage, he's already being forced to jump into bed with the mob.
Yeah, he was, and Frankie Carbo was, was a part of Murder Inc. This guy was a real gangster, this fella, and he went into the boxing side of things, which we'll discuss in a little while. But from the 1940s, this is when he really started in jumping into boxing from the mafia, because he was, as I said, a part of the Murder Inc. We'll mention that later on, but he was just an awful person, let's put it that way. And he went into boxing, and he was actually, what I mean, they referred to him as the Caesar of boxing. So that's how much he was an influence in the underground side of boxing in general. And once Carbo got wind of the fact that Sonny Liston was a heavyweight and he's a talent, he acted quickly. He realised he was going to earn himself a packet, and he pulled some strings and got Liston out of prison. Sentenced to 5 years, coming out in 2. I'm guessing that Father Stevens no doubt would have seen something and felt that Sonny could do things. We all know the mafia, they're always connected to, they're very religious, they're going to be connected with the church. I'm not saying that Father Stevens was in any way involved in it, but undoubtedly he's going to have monsters around him. So they got wind of the fact that Sonny was a decent, he was a good fighter. So he was released early. He was released early on October 31st in 1952.
Father Stevens, again, would play a pivotal role in this early stage of Sonny Liston's life and obviously his boxing career. So he directed the young Sonny Liston to Johnny Tocco's gym in St. Louis. So this is where Liston continued to gain his destructive reputation by going in there and sparring and absolutely destroying his opponents with that vicious left ramrod of a jab and the devastating power that he possessed. Boxing fans and a lot of boxing experts say Sonny Liston's jab was one of the greatest jabs in boxing history, and it's evident in some of the videos that you can see on the internet, on YouTube, of how hard of a jab that was, because he'd knock people out with that jab, it was that hard. So Johnny Tocco was actually Liston's first trainer. He described his massive visits as like ham hands. So basically, he was saying the size of Sonny Liston's hands were absolutely huge. Huge hands this guy had. His hands was probably the size of my head, to put it into perspective. And I've got a pretty big head, and this was absolutely unbelievable size of his hands. So his first supporting team was Tocco as his trainer and Bob Burns as his first manager in the amateurs. And something that doesn't get touched on a lot about Sonny Liston is the fact that he did actually have an amateur career. It was only very brief, but he did go on to win the Chicago Golden Gloves in less than a year by beating the 1952 Olympic heavyweight champion Ed Sanders and outpointing Julius Griffin, who was a winner of the New York Golden Gloves Tournament of Champions, so to capture the Intercity Golden Gloves Championship as a result. Sonny Liston's amateur career is, like I said, something that not a lot of people actually touch on, but he actually had some minor successes there along the way, didn't he?
He really did, and the fact that in 1952 he gets out of prison, and from that point, within a year, he's done what he's done. I mean, even Tocco explained that when he was putting him in the sparring, he was knocking guys out, and he was devastating more or less throughout all of his amateur career. I think there was one guy that beat him. I think he took him the distance. He never got stopped. I'm not quite sure the guy's name, but he did school him a little bit, showed him, it was a little bit of, I suppose he just knew how to fight and keep away from Sonny. And obviously they're short around, so, there's probably more chance of getting away from Sonny. But most of the time, he was blazing them out within no time, within 3 rounds. He was actually getting rid of them as well. And we know the amateurs, they have those 3 rounds. Chances are, Sonny's going to get rid of you. So, and that just shows you how destructive he was. But most of the time, as I say, they will go the distance and he goes to the judge's scorecard. So in 1953, it was the time when Sonny Liston decided he was going to turn pro. Now, he said, whatever you tell me to do, I'll do it. Now, when he said that, I believe he was saying it to the mafioso who picked him up. He was in a position where nobody really wanted to turn him pro. So his only backers were the crime underworld, and it was actually a chap who owned him, as he put it, and it was St. Louis mobster and that was John Vitale, who ended up actually owning approximately 12% of his contract throughout his career. Now, Vitale was an Italian St. Louis crime family. I think he was the head of it. He was the head of it for a little while, and then people say he wasn't. Either way, he was the guy that took over Sonny's career. Now, Sonny would fight in the ring, but in the daytime, he obviously needed some money. To get that money, he had to do some work, and he did it for Vitale, who was obviously the Sicilian American boss. And what Sonny would do was he would stop guys from strike. He was a strike breaker, they called him. So he mainly worked for the mob, working for the union boss of the cement local, and he was just an enforcer. So anyone that decided they wanted to strike, he weren't having none of it. He was there to be able to stop him. And as we've mentioned, his size, with his hands, for instance, actually made gloves to fit his hands, that big his hands were. They decided that I'm not going to be striking. As soon as they would pull Sonny out, I'm sure they decided, no, do you know what, I'm not having it. And then it all seemed to be going well. He's earning a bit of money. The mafia this guy's come in, he's giving him some money, he's giving him opportunities in the ring, he's turned professional, he's having a good career, until the point in 1956 when he was arrested. And he was arrested by a police officer for breaking his knee, apparently.
This incident in 1956 was quite a pivotal moment in his life outside of the ring, because as you rightly pointed out, he was arrested for assaulting a police officer who had actually ended up with a broken knee. Now, this was following an altercation over a parking ticket where Sonny Liston claimed that he was racially abused before picking up the officer and body slamming him to the floor. So he then goes on to pinch the officer's gun and did a runner. He was finally caught by the police a couple of nights later after doing the runner, and the arresting officer was an officer by the name of James Reddick, who was actually responsible for stopping his police colleague from shooting Liston dead. This was the start of the run-in with the police, where it was always going to be a turbulent affair between Liston and the police, and this was one of the more notable incidents in his life outside of the ring. When that happened, Sonny ended up back in the nick, but considering what he'd been charged for, which was assault to kill, his 7-month sentence was rather light. So that maybe give me a clear indication of what being affiliated to mobsters and the mafia can actually do. A little bit like being a drugs cheat in boxing and being affiliated to a massive promoter, and how light their bands can be. It sounds very similar in certain ways. So Sonny Liston ended up getting 7 months for that, whereas in reality probably could have got a lot longer for it. So if it wasn't for them in his earlier career, the mafia, he probably would have possibly never got to the heights that he did get to in his boxing career, because they no doubt, with all the evidence that is out there and available, that they definitely helped him in his career to climb that ladder. So not long after he was released from that 7-month sentence from prison, he was back in trouble straight away with the police yet again. This time, he apparently chucked a policeman headfirst into a dustbin.
Yeah, that was a story from what the documentary, actually, they mentioned that he picked another policeman up. Obviously, he just picks him up and throws him about, and this one he chucks in the bin. Yeah, but it weren't working out for him in St. Louis, unfortunately. And after further altercations with the police, this wasn't just the only two. These were the two that obviously are on record. There were several, apparently, and in the end, it was the police chief, apparently. I believe he was in a movie. I think they took him off somewhere, and someone in the film, they put a gun to his head or something, and they told him he needs to leave St. Louis. I'm not quite sure how true that was. I'm guessing he had enough, they had enough of him, and he decided, you know what, I'm getting out of here. And he left for Philadelphia in 1959. Now, there are documentations from the FBI that say Frank Blinky Palermo and Frankie Carbo, who we've just mentioned, had officially became his majority shareholders for his contract in 1960. In actual fact, it was 59. The police didn't have that documented. Now, just to give you an idea, with Frankie Carbo, as I say, he was a part of Murder Inc. He was a very well-known mafioso. And just to describe to you just how high these guys were, I mean, Frankie Carbo was a part of the combination. And the combination were a group of mafiosos that were successful in fixing high-profile boxing matches. Now, he was also affiliated, obviously, to Murder Inc. Murder Inc. was originally a group that was founded by Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Now, if anyone knows anything about the mafia, you won't go too far away from finding a name like Meyer Lansky, who was Charles Lucky Luciano's right-hand man. He was Jewish, and so was Bugsy Siegel. And Bugsy Siegel is the guy that's apparently the one that founded Vegas. It wasn't, it was another chap, but he was the first mobster that invested in Vegas. So that's just how far up that Liston was dealing with these guys. Carbo was a part of Murder Inc. They used to use Murder Inc. They built Murder Inc. and they used that for the Jewish and the Italian American mafias to work together and literally put hits out on people. So God knows how many people Frankie Carbo must have murdered in his lifetime, but I'm sure several. And Frank Blinky Palermo was associated with a Philadelphia crime family. Now, the reason why the Philadelphia crime family were linked in with the five families in New York City was because Philadelphia had Atlantic City. So Atlantic City was pretty big back then. You're going to earn a lot of money. There's casinos there. There's boxing events there. So that is where Blinky came in. Now, Blinky and obviously Carbo, they got together. They built an alliance. And they were at the forefront of the organised crimes that were affiliated to sport. And basically, Frankie Blinky Palermo and Frankie Carbo together owned pretty much the whole underworld of boxing at the time. And they were the guys that were running Sonny Liston. So that was just a brief description of just how deep Sonny Liston had got in before his professional career even kicked off.
We got working, and I got a couple of sparring partners. It was hard to get anybody to spar with him because the guy had hands like hams, you know. They had to have special gloves made to work with and everything else.
After Sonny turned pro, it wasn't long before the mob, which controlled boxing, began to notice him. Not too long later, they took over control. He became a mob fighter.
Sonny Liston first got out of prison in the early 50s, and at that time he was taken over by the top mobster in St. Louis, Johnny Vitale. Vitale ran the rackets there in St. Louis.
Vitale also had a construction business, and he ended up as a strike breaker for Vitale, a head cracker in St. Louis.
Laborers got out of line. Sonny was the guy that roughed them up. He would collect money for loan sharks and numbers writers. He was the typical bully who used his size to earn money, whether it was in the ring or out.
And they said that he was hooked up with the mob, he was this and that. But to me, if he was hooked up with the mob, we sure were poor.
The front men who actually managed and promoted Liston was Joseph Pep Baroni, who was a friend of Palermo's, and it was whilst he was in Philly that Liston's boxing career really took off. So he started to pick up some good wins over names such as Zora Foley, Cleveland Williams twice, and Eddie Mashin. And obviously that ramrod of a jab that we talked about a little bit earlier on was the pivotal moments of the fights where he would absolutely crush his opponents. And a lot of people, when they talk about Sonny Liston's in-ring boxing career, will always talk about the eyes of Sonny Liston and the way he used to be able to intimidate the fighters before the fighters had even started in the ring. So that was one of the most notable things about Sonny Liston inside the ring. But of course, outside the ring, it was still a turbulent affair. And he also had a turbulent affair with the press, of course. And they were absolutely savage, Sonny Liston, when talking about him. They would call him a beast. And there was so many much more worse slurs that were said about him, and it was very, very racial slurs that were said about him at that period of time. And obviously they're not ones that we're going to repeat. It's quite well documented of that period of time, the segregation and all the different uprising that was going on at that particular period of time. So if you really wanted to go out and check further about some of the press cuttings and things that were said about him, you can certainly go and check that out on the internet, because it is all there and it is well documented. The trouble with Liston at this point was that he became a target because of his reputation, and whilst he escaped St. Louis to get to Philadelphia, he was escaping the St. Louis police, he became a target for the Philadelphia police, just like the St. Louis ones before. So he was remained in the newspapers, and he was never featured in the sports pages, which is where you most of the time would see fighters, footballers, any sports you would see usually in the back of the papers, and you would read about it. Sonny Liston was never in the back of the papers. He was always portrayed as this, not what they wanted to see. They didn't want to see him as the face of boxing, and they continued to paint him as a menace. And because of these supposed ties to organised crime, it made him unworthy of a shot at the heavyweight title, which was something that he'd put himself in the position to do.
The current champion, Floyd Patterson, he was the man that Liston wanted. There was interviews on the documentary. There's a couple of documentaries out there. The mysterious death and life of Liston is one, and and there's an interview on there, and he's openly calling out Sonny and Cus D'Amato, who obviously I'm sure people will know Cus. If you know Mike Tyson, he was obviously around in Tyson's early career. He was the man behind Floyd Patterson. Now, Cus weren't silly. He knew that if Patterson got in the ring against Sonny Liston, he's going to get absolutely mauled, and he basically kept Floyd Patterson away from him because he put it as the crime connections. Now, Cus was involved also within a crime. Yet it wasn't necessarily as large and as deep as what Sonny Liston was. You know, this young, big, up-and-coming heavyweight champion, uneducated, getting bamboozled by these mafiosos. You know, easily you could just turn someone. You could imagine what Sonny was like as a youngster, and these guys that have been doing it for several years since the 40s. And Cus was he wasn't a part of that, but he was the smaller crime families like the Kansas City crime families and stuff like that. Now, I tried to dig in a little bit. I tried to find a little bit of information on Cus to see if he actually did. There were incidents, I'm not going to go too much into it, but it was just ironic and the irony of Cus saying what he was saying about Sonny. And obviously the other problem was that we had the civil rights movement and the National Association of the Advancement of Coloured People, which was the NAACP, and they were starting to build momentum. Now, you got to think back in these days, in sort of the late 50s and the early 60s, you know, these movements were massive, and there was some unbelievably influential people that were to create movement especially for the black right, like Malcolm X. So they were building momentum. They did not want somebody to become a symbol of their campaign. So even they were not interested in Sonny becoming world champion, and not only was it Cus D'Amato as well.
The heavyweight championship of the world is always a championship that's been held in great esteem. It's always been the money division. It's always been the main division that we've all focused on as boxing fans, and so much so that it was identifying of the man. That is how you'd identify the heavyweight champion of the world, the man of the boxing world, the man of the division. Now, if you look back into Legendary Nights and some of the series that we covered, we've got our Legendary Nights series, and to get a clear indicator of how much the heavyweight championship of the world really means and how significant it actually is, you go and listen to the tale of Joe Louis versus Max Schmeling, and you'll fully understand that particular tale and how much the heavyweight championship of the world was significant. So going back to Sonny Liston's in-ring career at this point, even in early January of 1962, Floyd Patterson actually met with President John F. Kennedy at the White House, and he'd even urged Floyd Patterson to find an opponent with a better character. And it was just 2 years later that JFK would end up being assassinated. So JFK was also someone that said to Floyd Patterson, you need to find someone different than this guy, because this guy, we don't want him anywhere near the heavyweight title. In 1962, of course, Sonny Liston finally got his shot at the World Heavyweight Championship against Floyd Patterson, and it was on September the 25th in Chicago, and it only took Sonny Liston 2 minutes and 6 seconds to stop the gentleman of boxing.
It was an emphatic victory, and one that, I mean, I think everybody sort of felt this was going to be the case, and it was just how everyone planned, albeit I think the odds were in Patterson's favour. I think they didn't necessarily tip Sonny. I think people still felt that Patterson may get the victory. Wasn't to be, obviously. He was absolutely destroyed. And ironically, just before this fight as well, this was the moment when he was in the restaurant with his wife, and a waitress come up to him, and basically she said to him that, Sonny, this is your son. And they actually took the son, Sonny's boy, and Geraldine, his wife, was just accepting of it, and she actually fully adopted him, and it was their only son on record. Apparently he was a bit of a shitbag, and he liked to sleep about, so I'm sure he had plenty of other children sort of scattered around, but this was the one son he did have with this waitress. And Geraldine, to her credit, I mean what an amazing woman she must have been, to just accept the fact that, you know, this was he's a bit on the side, here's your child, and she adopted him. So that was interesting. In 62, he has a son, and then he beats Patterson. I mean, the world must be looking great. You know, he's on his return to Philadelphia. He's playing the speech on the aeroplane. He's ready to address his adoring fans, and he's hoping, you know, he's going to be received as this hero welcome back in Philadelphia. But unfortunately, not a single person showed up. And I think this was a turning point for Liston. He was absolutely devastated. He really felt that as soon as he becomes the heavyweight champion of the world, it's going to make a significant impact on his life. It's going to change public perception, but unfortunately it just wasn't to be. No one wanted to know him.
It's horrible because you can tell by the unfortunate circumstances that he was born into that he certainly tried to change his life, and he feels by becoming the heavyweight champion of the world at this point, that's going to be the pivotal moment that changes his life for him. And obviously, as you rightly pointed out, it was a heartbreaking moment for him. That victory actually did nothing to influence the perception of the fans or the media at the time. And I think this is the moment where it puts a significant dent in his boxing career. And as we move on throughout his career, inside and outside of the ring, you'll start to get this is where it starts to go on a little bit of a downward spiral. This was actually his best night in boxing. So he won the world heavyweight title against Floyd Patterson, and yet it was also the bittersweet moment for him because nobody turned up at the airport to greet him. Nobody wanted to write about him. Nobody wanted to say, yes, you are the heavyweight champion of the world. I think the decisions following this particular incident were definitely made without any care of what people actually might think of him, because no matter what he did, he must have felt his future wasn't going to change. He could have done anything else in the world and people would have still looked at him the way they did. It was a moment that I don't think he ever really recovered from, looking back at his career inside and outside of the ring after such a great disappointment after winning that World Heavyweight Championship. I think part of you starts to feel a little bit sorry for him at this point, because you think he seems like he's got this sort of nice side to him which has not been allowed to be put out there to fans and to the media, and he's just been portrayed as such a bad guy. And we appreciate, there was obviously ties to the mafia, but he was kind of forced into bed with them from the off, really, from coming out of prison. This was the only opportunity he was given, and this was what he had to do to sort of get himself out there to try and make a better life for himself. So you do start to feel a little bit sorry for him at this point.
Yeah, you do, absolutely. And obviously, the last straw, and it broke the camel's back, was when he was picked up in a park by the Philly police, for driving too slow. In a random routine check, he was getting pulled up for talking to people in Philadelphia. He's a heavyweight champion in the world. I mean, as you mentioned earlier, Sean, the man, he was easily identifiable as the heavyweight champion. Everybody knew he was, and no one liked it. Everyone hated the fact that he had this mafia connections. And it wasn't just the racial thing. It wasn't just the white community. It was also the black community. They didn't want him to be their champion. So he felt isolated and alone. And he even said in the end, he decided, you know what, I've had enough of Philly. And he said, I would rather be a lamppost in Denver than the mayor of Philadelphia. And Denver was his next move. He decided he's going to leave Philly, and he shunned all the people from there, and he decided, you know what, I'm going to Denver. And there was a reason for that. Obviously, Geraldine went along with him. She's just accepted this son that's just now appeared in their life, and I don't know how she ever put up with him, to be honest with you. He wasn't a great husband, let's put it right. And there was a guy called Father Murphy, and another father, another reverend, who lived in Denver. And Liston felt that if he goes and stays near Murphy, then hopefully he will start getting to a position where the police are off his back, and he starts to gain a little bit more respect. So he goes, and Father Murphy was a major influence in him. And I'm guessing he was Irish. I believe. I mean, just looking at some of his quotes and the things he said about Sonny, was like, this guy deserves a break. He deserves a chance. And he was happy. He almost was like a teacher to him. He really did look up to his Father Murphy, and he tried to make an impact on Liston's life. And Liston was hopeful that hopefully he would stay out of trouble. Now the trouble was that when he wasn't with Geraldine and he wasn't with Father Murphy, he would be out and he'd be on the piss. He'd be drinking all the time, and he was drinking and driving around in a big white Cadillac. And unfortunately, by this point, the Denver police this is what rumoured as well, alleged, that they had a photo up. The Denver police had a photo up in their car of Sonny Liston, and if you ever see him, just pull him over. And the Denver police did exactly the same as what the St. Louis police did and Philadelphia did, and they harassed him. And when he wasn't with Geraldine, he wasn't with Father Murphy, he was out getting pissed, drinking and driving, getting stopped. And there's footage of it where he's getting stopped. You can see him pointing at the officers, round with the officers, but they just wouldn't give him a break. And that was it. I mean, it wasn't legal to drink and drive at the time. I suppose they just decided to keep stopping him in his lavish car, and maybe if he chose a better car, a bit less ambiguous, he'd probably blend in a little bit more. He might have been left alone, but I suppose that was Sonny. He got to that point, from moving off that aeroplane at Philadelphia, he didn't give a crap anymore. He didn't care what people felt with him and what people perceived him as, and he felt a bit vindicated and just carried on. Now, if people were telling you this bad person, you're this monster, well, I might as well be it because I'm trying to do things to change it, and it's not happening. And that's basically where he was at that point in 1963.
So moving in then to 1963 and talking about some of the significant events outside of the ring, before the second scheduled Patterson fight, him making the defence of the World Heavyweight Championship, he would come across a certain young, brash upstart with a mouth like I don't know what, by the name of Cassius Clay. And Cassius Clay, at this point, was obviously trying to make his mark in boxing, and he'd begin his pursuit of Sonny Liston. So wherever Sonny Liston would go, Cassius Clay would go, and he would antagonise him. And interviews, he would talk about him being a big ugly bear. He even went to the extent of driving to Sonny Liston's home in Denver and basically beeping his horn outside of his house and shouting for Sonny Liston to come out of his house and face him now. I think it was a few days or a few weeks. It's not 100% confirmed what time period it was, but before the second Patterson fight, Liston actually bumped into Clay in a Vegas casino. Now, there are actually different stories about this altercation. It's also rumoured that there may have even been two separate incidents that happened. Now, one statement was that Liston had actually slapped Cassius Clay while he was at the craps table, and then there was another that was where Cassius Clay confronted Liston while he was at the blackjack table, calling him a big ugly bear. But Liston had basically switched and told him to go and fuck off, or otherwise he's going to go and knock him out. And it's at this point, apparently, Clay shit his pants.
I think I would too. I don't know what he was thinking. He's probably losing on that blackjack table if the rumours are true. And Clay, at the end of the day, he's trying to get a title shot. I think he was pursuing Patterson before that, and obviously he defeats him. So obviously Clay targets Liston, and it's quite funny to hear those stories about whether they were alleged. I don't really know. Some people say that he slapped Clay. I don't think. I think the rumour is that he approached him at the blackjack table and basically he told him where to go, told him to fuck off, and that was it. That was Clay. He was around at the time. He was bigging himself up, and he was all mouth, but people obviously didn't realise just how good he was going to be. And it was from this point that the rematch was being drawn up for Patterson. Patterson wanted the rematch. People told him, don't take the rematch. Custamato told him, don't take the rematch. But he did. He took the rematch with Sonny Liston, and he lasted 4 seconds longer than the first fight. Basically, he was blown out in no time. And Sonny Liston had defended his title against Floyd Patterson. And people, I hear rumours as well that Floyd Patterson actually took a disguise of him before the fight, just in case he lost, so he could put on his hat and a fake beard and escape through the back door. And that was from Bunsey. Bunsey actually said he picked up that story, and I believe it. I wouldn't be surprised, because I think Patterson probably knew himself. He probably was going to get done again, and he was. And Sonny, after the fight, said that the public is not with me now, but they will have to swing along until somebody comes along and beats me. So, he has had enough, and he's going to continue with this bad boy image, and that's how he's going to roll. And although he appeared on television programs to try and soften his image, it still didn't work. He was that bad boy. He was connected with the mafia. That was it. Nobody trusted him. And the only people that he actually really enjoyed, and you actually see the footage as well, is when he's around children. It's the only times you ever see Sonny sort of happy. It's just the way it was. Nobody outside of that, if he weren't from his walk of life, it weren't young children, they just had this persona, and they didn't want to know him. So, still the heavyweight champion, but there was a young Clay knocking on the door. That was inevitably what was coming next.
I was sports editor and columnist for the Philadelphia Daily News when Liston came to town. He had a reputation as a fearsome puncher, as a potential rival for heavyweight champion Floyd Patterson. The problem was his name began to appear on the front pages of the newspaper more than in the sports sections of the newspaper. And immediately that turned off a lot of people. He had a number of brushes with the law, which were quite unusual for a celebrity athlete in those days.
So no matter what he did, no matter where he tried to go onto the TV and do interviews and do public appearances and try and show people that there is just a normal human being inside this big, giant heavyweight champion of the world, and no matter what he did, it was just always shot down again. No matter how many times he tried to to give this perception of himself as he's, you know, I'm a decent guy. Nobody wanted to know. Nobody was interested. They already had this perception of him at this point. And because of all the connections to the mob, all that work he was trying to put in to make this perception different about himself was always undone. And it was from those ties with Carbo and Palermo that Liston actually came over to Britain in September of 1963 and was apparently paid £500 by the Cray twins to visit one of their clubs. Now, this particular link stemmed from Palermo's association with the Philadelphia crime family, which was headed by Angelo Bruno, who ran the largest number of rackets in that city before moving into boxing.
It's interesting, actually, because Bruno Palermo, if anyone ever watched The Craze and Legend, there's always an American guy in the films, and it's Angelo Bruno who actually is the fella, and he was the head of the Philadelphia crime family. And it was interesting because I was trying to figure out, when I see this photo of Sonny Liston and the Craze, I always used to think, how on earth had he come over here and been a part of and gone to visit the Craze? Now, I knew they'd given £500. I never understood how, and it was literally it would have been from Palermo's association with the Philly crime mob and Bruno knowing the Craze, and that's probably where that stemmed from, and the fact that he did come over and he visited Great Britain, and it was during Sonny's visit in Great Britain that he dressed apparently like a 1920s Chicago gangster, which people still say it was a bit strange why he was dressed like that, but that was what he did. He rode a white horse through Newcastle. He wore a kilt in Glasgow, and he even had a go on a bagpipe. And he enjoyed Great Britain, and he felt like it was a warm welcome, and people treated him well. He actually says it was warm here, and he was among warm people. He reacted to it, and it was when he turns back to the United States of America, he said he'd be cold again. So he obviously felt like it was a good camaraderie in Great Britain, and while Liston was over Britain, he also had exhibition fights at Wembley Arena, which was organised by Mickey Duff.
So it's funny, this story about the exhibition bouts at Wembley Arena, because these were organised by Mickey Duff, who's a very well-known promoter in boxing history in the UK for British boxing. So after the exhibition bout, he actually told Mickey Duff he wanted to meet a lady of the night. So if anybody doesn't know what a lady of the night is, it's a hooker or it's a prostitute or whichever name you want to use for it. He basically wanted to go and get his end away, which was what he wanted to do. So Mickey Duff actually had no idea about he could go about getting him a bit of brass. So he asked the nightclub owner to help him out, and the Scottish girl apparently said she'd happily spend the night with Sonny Liston. So the next morning, Duff went to pick up Sonny Liston for interviews that had been arranged, and he was greeted with a young girl giving Sonny a mouthful. Now, Duff asked what was wrong, and she said that Sonny had only given her a tenner, which is £10 in English money, for a night's work. Now, Mickey had told Sonny that a tenner isn't a lot of money, and that he should give her a bit more. And so Sonny shrugged his shoulders and said, yeah, well, what about all the sandwiches she ate?
Tickles me every time. I think you get the idea of what Sonny was like, especially around young girls. And I really feel for Mickey Duff. He must have been like, what on earth I got myself involved in here. Found it a great story, and obviously he enjoyed it over here. And so back into 1964, one of Liston's closest friends had become a gentleman called Ash Resnick. Now, Ash Resnick was a Las Vegas casino operator of the Thunderbird and Caesars Hotel and Casino, to be precise, and he was also connected with, obviously, the New York Mafia. Now, while Sonny was in Vegas preparing for the first fight against Ali, which was arranged, that was his next fight. I say Ali, it was actually Cassius Clay. He was pretty much under Resnick's influence. Now, Resnick was a bad influence on Liston, and Liston didn't train properly, and we've mentioned Clay. Clay was a brash-speaking guy. Nobody understood how good Clay was ever going to be. And Liston was more interested in gambling and women, as you heard from the story with Mickey Duff. And yeah, so he basically didn't train too well. Clay was a complete underdog going into the fight. As I say, he had a big mouth and he sold the fight wonderfully well. He upstaged Liston in the antics before fight and at press events, and Clay was just as we know Muhammad Ali to be. And as I say, a number of pundits, I believe I read that 30 pundits chose a winner. Only 2 chose Clay to win this fight. He was a complete underdog, and Sonny Liston was going to go in there and absolutely destroy him, and that's what everybody felt.
Well, they did. Everybody felt like Sonny Liston was going there and just beat this guy who was just all talk and no trousers. But obviously history tells us something completely different, because Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, as we would go on to know him later on, was quite simply brilliant that night, right up until the point that he actually ended up blinded at the end of the 4th round. Now, Cassius Clay had told Angelo Dundee, his trainer, to cut the gloves off because he couldn't see, but Dundee told Clay to keep fighting and just try and stay away from Liston until his eyes had cleared. Now, Dundee had actually said that he dabbed his pinky finger into the solution and put it in his own eyes, and it burnt. Now, after Liston unsuccessfully wasn't able to take advantage of the fact that Cassius Clay was blind, he quit on his stool after the 6th, after Cassius Clay was able to weather the storm, come back, and with his blistering hand speed, seemingly, he made Sonny Liston quit because he was so frustrated that he couldn't get anywhere near him, that his chance of beating him had completely gone. Now, this was where people started to feel like maybe the fight was actually rigged to make money on betting coups. It's difficult to believe because the odds were 8-1, and they remained quite like that all the way up until the night of the fight, which I think to us indicates that there weren't going to be any large sums of money actually placed on Cassius Clay on this night to win. All the pundits thought Sonny Liston was going to destroy him. So that to me doesn't really indicate that this particular fight in Sonny Liston's career was one that was fixed, that was rigged. This feels like more he was underprepared and undertrained for this particular fight and ended up going on to lose his title. Joe Polino, who's the head trainer in Liston's corner and was also at the centre of some controversy, suggested that Liston told Polino to smear a solution on his gloves so that he could blind Clay. So there's that rumour that's gone around over the years that it was actually Sonny Liston who told his cornerman Polino to actually smear that bit of solution on his gloves so he could blind him, so he could slow him down, so he could take the opportunity to get this guy, because he was too fast, he was too agile for him. It was interesting, this story, because Eddie Machen, who was beaten by Liston in 1960, actually said the same thing happened to him in his fight as well.
I mean, the betting thing, I've read that apparently Ash Resnick and Liston made $1 million. Now, that doesn't make sense because obviously 8-1, it remained 8-1. It didn't change, so it suggests that didn't happen. So if you put in a big load of money on Clay, you know, Liston's odds are going to drop, and it didn't happen. So I don't believe there was any fix in that. I do believe that possibly that the solution may have been spread on the gloves because, exactly as you said, Sean, I think Liston felt that he just can't catch him. And you do see it, and again, I'll go back to the documentary because you can see it, and even when you watch the fight, Liston really does put it on Clay. He really does. He thinks he can get rid of him. He's obviously blood, he can't see, but he weathers the storm and comes back. And I think at that point, Liston just thought, I haven't trained, I'm not going to do it. And that was one of the worst things he could have done, because not only is he being ridiculed by the press and by those within the boxing circle, those within just life, because the heavyweight in general was a big thing for the public, and to quit on your stall, it didn't go down well, and it just got worse for Liston. It just seemed to just be a ball that just kept rolling and getting bigger, and I mean, even Angelo Dundee did turn around, and he still believes that in actual fact that he didn't cheat, he didn't spread the solution. He believed that the solution was used on Liston's cut, and it was from the cut that they put the solution, because they can use solutions and smelling salts and stuff like that back then, and the solution went on the eye to try and close the cut. Obviously, Clay's been hitting him, and Liston leans his head in, they rub heads, gets into Clay's eyes, and that's where the result of the burning comes from. So that's what Angelo Dundee still to this day believes that nothing was in it, there was nothing bad about it, but yet he was still under investigation himself because of his brother, and his brother was involved in the promotion of it, which is a whole other story. But basically, Liston quit, and it didn't go down well.
When I threw the punch with the left, and I went back to my corner, the whole glove felt like it was full of water. And when I raised my arm, it felt like it was lead in the glove.
Most heavyweight champions would rather be carried out on their shield than to quit on a stool.
We move into 1965, and the rematch was set in Boston And Liston trained harder than he'd ever trained before because he wanted to win this fight so badly. He wanted to get that World Heavyweight title back. He wanted to get that frustration that he had out. But unfortunately, Ali actually suffered a hernia on Friday the 13th of all days, which was 3 days before the original scheduled bout, so it was called off. Now, many observers and boxing experts believe that Liston would have actually won if the original date had gone ahead. That's something we'll never ever know, but at the time, a lot of pundits felt like Liston had got the eye of the tiger back and he would go in there and he would beat Cassius Clay. If he would have done that, that would have changed boxing history. Would it have changed his life outside of the ring? Nobody will ever know. So on top of that, Liston's manager, who was Jack Neyland, was being investigated, among others, for fixing the first fight. Plus, the FBI were actually investigating a possible fix for the second fight. So there was rumours flying around and obviously evidence out there, or intelligence out there, to suggest that maybe this rematch was going to be fixed. Now, the cornerman, Johnny Tocco, said that John Bertelli, another gangster associated with the mob, told him that the second fight will last 1 round, which, when a mobster's telling you this fight is going to last 1 round, and you can imagine how that's being said to Johnny Tocco. If you're Johnny Tocco, you're thinking, right, if this fight doesn't end in 1 round, I'm probably going to be swimming with the fishes not long afterwards. So that indicates to me there that possibly that could have been a fix. But the plot obviously thickens as well, because apparently the mob and the Nation of Islam, who was Cassius Clay's religion, who he'd converted to, who he'd become a part of their uprising and their group, apparently it was agreed that Liston was going to take a dive in this fight with Ash Resnick, who comes up again, spearheading the negotiations with a plan for Sonny Liston to earn a percentage of Cassius Clay, a la Muhammad Ali's future purses. Again, there's so many theories going around that this was something that was very pivotal in Sonny Liston's rematch with Cassius Clay, a la Muhammad Ali, because the fight itself, history obviously shows us that it looked like it was a dive, it looked like he quit, it looked like the punch never landed, and hearing stories like this start to make theorise whether this is actually a possibility about this.
Oh, absolutely. Apparently this Ash Resnick meeting and the fact that he was going to get these future earnings from his purses and the benefit of Ali having a world title wasn't necessarily financial gain for the Nation of Islam. It was more to do with the fact that they would have a Muslim as the heavyweight champion. So you can understand why they would have this meeting with Ash Resnick, who was obviously affiliated with the mob. So, with all that's going on, nobody wanted to touch this fight. Everyone's being investigated. All the top states around America did not want to know, and that's why this fight ended up in Lewiston, Maine. And it was agreed to be made on the 25th of May, 1965. Now, just before that, or I think it may have just been as it was announced, Malcolm X was murdered as well, who was obviously affiliated with the Nation of Islam. So there was so much controversy that surrounded the second fight that you can't help but think it was a fix, and then especially when you actually go into the fight itself.
That fight itself is known as the Phantom Punch fight because the right hand that landed from Ali on the top of Liston's head, it didn't look like it landed. It didn't look like it really hurt him. It didn't look like the sort of a punch which would knock down a heavyweight the size of Sonny Liston. It looked like it was a glancing blow that might have just skimmed the top of his head. But people suggest that looking back at the footage and using the technology of today to slow it down, it actually looked like it really landed and scrambled his senses and landed on his temple. But I think a lot of people do feel that this fight was through and it was fixed and it was all mob affiliated, and there's so much controversy and actual evidence out there to suggest that this fight actually might have been thrown by Sonny Liston. You've got to remember at this point, Sonny Liston, as we've put you in the picture of his life and his career outside of the ring, is affiliated with the mob. He's had a shit upbringing. People absolutely hate him. He's had to move from St. Louis to Philly to Denver because the police are constantly harassing him. So he's getting to the point where he's absolutely getting that pissed off where he's thinking, you know what, if they're going to give me a deal where I'm going to get money out of this guy's future fights, and this guy looks like he's potentially going to go on to be a big star, then I might as well just throw the fight and sit at home and take the rewards and reap the rewards of that. But that was never going to be the case, even if this was true, and even if this was what actually happened. It was never going to be the case because he was always in bed with the mob. As Liston attempted to get up from the phantom punch, he fell over again before finally returning to his feet with the referee, who was the famous fighter Jersey Joe Walcott, ready to allow the fight to continue. Unbeknown to Jersey Joe Walcott at the time, Liston had actually already been counted out. At the ringside, they have someone who obviously does the timer, and the timer had actually said he'd been counted out. So the fight was stopped, and Ali had won again. The crowd were absolutely furious, and you can hear the chants of fix, fix, fix.
There was a punch, and a hard punch that landed in a vulnerable place. There is footage that shows Liston's neck being snapped back by that punch.
The thing that bothered me is Liston could take a hell of a punch. I'd seen him fight guys that were devastating punches. I've seen him fight those guys. I've seen those guys knock the daylights out of him for a while, but then he would always come on to knock him out.
Ali hit him so fast, Ali really didn't know he hit him. Because I took the mouthpiece out of Ali's mouth in that fight. And he told me, he said, he laid down. I said, no. I said, you hit it. So he asked me, he said, man, I think he laid. I said, no, man, you hit him. And it took a long time before he saw the punch that he hit Sonny with.
What did you think of the fight last night?
I think it was a fake fight, very fake.
Well, what did you think of it?
I thought it was a phony.
Let me tell you, the minute he hit the floor, I heard, they said, fix! And you could hear the ring. Did you hear the people hollering, fix?
Yeah, I heard it.
I heard him say, fix! Fix! As soon as he fell. I said, get up! Come on! I mean, fix. I don't know nothing about no fix.
The story that I have got from various members of Sonny's camp was that two fellas did come up to training camp and represented themselves as black Muslims.
They called on Sonny, and they spoke to him privately, and that they told Sonny that if he won the rematch, that he was a dead man.
Yeah, and I can't help but think it was. The more I look into it and the more you read about stuff, it's just everything that surrounds this fight suggests to me that this was a fix. And I think even everybody knew it. You know, there's interviews of fans that went and they all said the same. It was a fix, and it just seemed that way. So in 1966, and obviously being an Englishman ourselves, 1966 was a fabulous year. The year England won the World Cup. Aside from that, Liston, after the second defeat, obviously ridiculed from the public, named as a coward after quitting in the first fight, a sellout for the second fight for taking a dive. He was bottom of the scrap heap, and basically he needed to escape. And to escape, Sonny and Geraldine went off to Sweden, and they fought 4 fights in Stockholm and Gothenburg.
We move into 1968 and 1969 now, and once they'd returned from Sweden, they moved from Denver to Las Vegas. Now, Las Vegas, as we've spoke about earlier, is the place where Ash Resnick was based, the guy that owned the casino over there, and was quite an influential man. And some people actually say, and it's been speculated, that he was one of the founders of the Las Vegas nighttime economy, and he was one of the guys that helped create Las Vegas as we know it today. You've got to look at what the period of time we're in here to put it into context. You've got a period of time where you've got a lot of corruption going on. You've got a lot of different mob families going around. You've got corrupt guys like Ash Resnick knocking about as well. And then you've got guys like Sonny Liston coming to the forefront, this ex-heavyweight champion who had this affiliation, who was a big guy who, you know, you could basically use him to do your dirty work, so to speak. And then not only did you have all that going on, you also had the Las Vegas, Nevada Police Department, who, by all accounts and all the evidence that is out there, suggests that they weren't the greatest of police departments at that particular period of time. There were a lot of strong-arm tactics. There were a lot of dodgy dealings and rough things that were going around at that time. So Las Vegas, for him to move from Denver to Las Vegas was, for me, looking at his life and where it had come from to where it was going to where this led him to, this is where I feel was the beginning of the end for Sonny Liston.
It really was, and it was the time where we started to have this double life. You know, the east and the west coast of Las Vegas was a big thing in the 60s, and you know, back in the early 60s, the east and the west, it was always divided. You had the black community in the west, and then you had the main strip, which was the east. Many of the top stars at the time would would be in the east side of Vegas, and they would be out and they would go to casinos, and all sorts of whatever they were getting up to out there, and they would end up in the West, and the West was the place to go. It was the place where all the good music was, and they could enjoy themselves. But then by the time Sonny arrives in Vegas in the late 60s, it was deeply segregated, and it was violent, and it was very corrupt in those days. And the West Side, in particular, which was such a booming place for the black community, it had just fallen apart. It had become a ghost town, and the reason for that was because of the riots that had happened, and you know, you had burnt out buildings, you had the casinos were worn down, and it was dark and dingy, and the worst of the worst were there. There were drug dealers, there were people on drugs. So, I mean, in the late 60s, you still had Elvis was playing at the National twice a night. You had Sinatra, who was still prominent across the strip in the east side, and Sonny would go there. Sonny Liston would be mingling with Joe Louis, Sammy Davis Jr. By then, apparently, they say, and allegedly, he was dealing drugs. And he would, later on in the evening, he had this double life where he would get in his pink Cadillac and he would drive to the west side and he would spend the night there. And even Geraldine says there would be nights and long weekends where you just wouldn't see Sonny. He'd disappear and then he would end up at home later on in the evening. So it was a very dark place. And it was from that point that he ended up meeting up with Robert Chednik. Robert Chednik is a guy in the 1960s who was a saxophone, always a part of a jazz club or a group. That was his real name, but he had Rodney was his other name. And he was actually a famous jazz player. But he ended up becoming a dealer of heroin and cocaine. Sonny got involved with him. But also in that, as I say, in the east side of Vegas, he literally mingled with the top guys. He still had a good boxing career. He went on a fantastic run, and he was mingling with the likes of Sammy Davis Jr. and Ed Sullivan.
After Sonny moved to Vegas, he became more and more under the influence of Ash Resnick.
He started hanging around with the wrong people. Friends of his were told by police out in Las Vegas that Sonny's hanging out with the wrong folks. There's a drug deal going down and Sonny's involved in it.
There were all kinds of allegations as to what Sonny was doing. There were those that say he'd gone back to his old job as collecting debts for the mob. There were those that say he was pushing heroin. Sonny was pretty much just being Sonny Liston, doing the same kind of things, associating with the same kind of people he always had.
There were the two faces of Sonny Liston. One of the faces was this man who was totally abstinent, perfectly well behaved, but around people that he ran with in the night, he behaved another way. There was a Jekyll and Hyde aspect to his personality.
Well, it was crazy because you had these two lives that was going on for Sonny Liston there. You had one side of his life where it was dark and it was murky and he was getting involved with people that were also leading double lives. When you talk about Robert Chudnik, aka Red Rodney, jazz player in the evenings but also heroin dealer during the day, it was absolutely crazy to look into the sort of stuff that went on behind the scenes there. But for Sonny Liston, his boxing career was still going pretty well, even though he'd been put to the bottom of the pile after he seemingly quit in the first fight against Ali and then seemingly took a dive in the second fight against Ali. He actually came back after that loss on a winning streak of 14 victories. I mean, it was against weaker opposition. It wasn't against, any big-time opponents. But his dream of becoming a world champion once again, it looked possible. And he also had a young Olympic champion in the camp by the name of George Foreman as a sparring partner. Now, George Foreman idolized Sonny Liston, and all the TV appearances that he was making, the programs that he was going on, the commercials that he was getting in, and even a couple of movies, the perception of him was starting to change again. The tide was starting to turn, and it seemed like being in Las Vegas was maybe where things were going to start to look up for him. And as you rightly pointed out, he was being with the likes of Sammy Davis Jr. and Ed Sullivan, and there was various different people that loved to be around Sonny Liston, and he obviously even mingled with the great Joe Louis as well at one point, who at this point of his life was working in Las Vegas in the casinos as well, because he needed money at this point in his life as well. But wherever Sonny Liston goes, trouble would always follow him, no matter where he went in his life.
And Ash Resnick was never too far away from him. Although he was amongst his positive influences in his life, and Ed Sullivan and Sammy Davis Jr., they really did try to push his career on. He just had this dark side with Ash Resnick, and who had become a friend, associate, sort of manager, who was a terrible influence. And then obviously from that's where he met Red Rodney, and Red Rodney's son, whose name's just Mark. That's all I know him. And And it was with Mark that he teamed up to be an enforcer. He was actually the leader of like a crime family type of drug dealing company, I suppose. So him and Mark, Liston and Mark, would go round and they would go and see junkies and they would get money from them because he was an enforcer. He was a big guy, something he had learned. And he was taught, although Red Rodney was a heroin dealer, he was also a user of the drugs. He was also a compulsive thief as well, apparently. But the old phrase of don't get high off your own supply obviously didn't appeal to Red Rodney because he was obviously getting high himself. And it was at this point in 1969. There's a guy called Earl Cage. Now, Earl Cage was a beautician by day and a dealer by night. And once again, you're in the dark side of Vegas, you're going to be dealing with these unsavoury characters, and Liston was in his house at the time, and the DEA comes and raids the house. Now, everybody's arrested, all bar Sonny Liston. Sonny Liston gets away with it. He just says he's getting a haircut. He gets let off. Earl Cage was a big-time drug dealer, like Red Rodney, and he was upset with it. He went down. He was hoping Liston was going to put in a word for him and get him out. He didn't. So for him, he was not happy with Liston, and in actual fact, he put a contract out for his life. So Earl Cage was one pissed off fella, and from that point, Red Rodney actually decided he didn't really want any more connections with Sonny Liston either. So he actually told Mark to not deal with him anymore. But while he was Red Rodney out doing his music and his jazz, doing a jazz night, Liston shows up at the house. Mark says, "You ain't coming in." He barges his way in, grabs Mark up against the wall, takes the drugs and leaves. And that was how Liston was at the time. It's alleged that he was on drugs. No doubt he was selling it as well. And obviously he lost that connection with Red Rodney and Mark as well as Earl Cage. So clearly straight away now we're getting in a position where people are starting to turn against Sonny Liston.
We move into 1970 and the last year of Sonny Liston's life and the turbulence of that last particular year and what you've just rightly mentioned there about the connections and the sour relationships that he ended up with. Now, in his boxing career, he actually got knocked out in 1969, pretty much ending the dream of ever becoming a world champion once more. Now, he actually had one more professional fight, and that was the real-life Rocky. If you've ever heard the story of Chuck Wepner, it's a brilliant story, and it was actually what Sly Stallone based his character Rocky on. In what was a bloody slugfest, Wepner actually retired on his stool in the 9th. Now, apparently Liston, in this fight, was told to take a dive. Apparently the mob had said to him, right, we want you to take a dive against Chuck Wepner, and Liston turned around and said, do you know what? No, I want to win this fight. And if that was true, if that story is true, now that story has been reported by numerous journalists and in different books. If that story was true, then basically he's not only cut ties with two angry other former dealers, he's also putting his life on the line because he's also basically telling the mob that I've helped get him to a certain position in his life. You know, it's not the right way of getting to that position, but they've helped him get there. They've basically cut ties with them because he's saying, no, I ain't doing this for you. So at this point in time, he's got the mob, he's got Earl, and then he's also obviously got Red Rodney, where these relationships have completely gone sour. So it's not looking great when you've got this many people that are pissed off, that are very dangerous individuals as well. For this particular fight against Chuck Wepner, he actually earned $13,000 for the fight. Now, $10,000 of that $13,000 was actually paid towards a loan, and the other $3,000 actually went to his cornerman. So Liston actually fought his last boxing bout of his career for nothing. Literally no money whatsoever. It's just a sort of sad state of affairs that he couldn't even earn any money off his last fight. What's going to happen next? Well, obviously he's going to continue in this life of crime outside of the ring that was going on.
And it was at this point that, you know, he's driving around in his pink Cadillac going from east to west, sort of throwing his weight about, thinking he's the man, just getting rid of those connections with the mob, not accepting what they're telling him to do, dealing with gangsters, drug dealers, he's rubbing them up the wrong way. And then in 1970, the world heavyweight scene was all about a certain Muhammad Ali's return to the ring after his exile due to refusing to enroll in the Vietnam War. Now, the current champion, of course, was Joe Frazier, who had picked up his world titles, and he was the champion of the world, and everybody felt his Ali Frazier's going to happen 1971. So all the talk is about that fight. And Sonny Liston, bottom of the pile again, no friends, no money, and he was out, and he was rumoured to be very vocal about being frozen out the percentage of Ali's $5 million earnings for his fight. Now, that goes back to that alleged meeting with Ash Resnick and the Muslim community who Ali was affiliated with to pick up his sort of a percentage of his earnings for the rest of his career. Obviously, with Ali in exile as well, that probably didn't help things, but he weren't getting all that money. And it was mentioned earlier that this is apparent again, that Liston and Resnick had a conversation, a public spat, where people witnessed it, and Liston was saying to Ash, you know, where's my cut? Where's my money? I got, you know, why I got no money? You need to sort me out my money. And Ash, to be fair, is the only guy that's close to Liston at the minute because he's severed all his ties. And apparently, so that Liston, it wasn't just the one altercation; it was several where he would be out and he'd be mouthing off and telling people that he's owed money for this Ali Frazier fight. And basically, the mob don't take too kindly to big mouths and rats. And he was left in a bit of a pickle. Not only is he severed all his ties of all these drug dealers and mob dealers, now he's just wound up Ash Resnick, who is affiliated with the American mob. He has now become a guy who's not earning any money for anybody. He's got no money. He's a drug dealer. He's on drugs. Who knows what drugs he was on, but his life had just spiraled into a position of just, it was out of control. And it all turned New Year's Eve in 1970.
Sonny Liston, the former heavyweight boxing champion, was found dead last night in his Las Vegas home by his wife. He was 38. He had been dead for at least a week. An autopsy failed to show the cause of death, and further studies will be made. Police said that they found small quantities of what appeared to be heroin and marijuana in the home.
We get to New Year's Eve, 1970. At this point in time, Liston's wife, Geraldine, she's away. She's visiting family in St. Louis. She's gone back there to visit a bit of family. Obviously, Sonny Liston stayed over in Las Vegas, doing what he's doing. As we've just spoke about, he's been rattling his mouth off. He's been going out there. He's been swinging himself around and throwing his weight around, so to speak. And obviously he's pissed a hell of a lot of people off at this point. January the 5th, 1971. Geraldine has basically been trying to get a hold of Sonny Liston for numerous amounts of days over the holiday period, but she's not been able to get over him. Bearing in mind, obviously, we didn't have technology back then the same we do now. So literally a phone call probably would have been the only method of contact to get a hold of him over that period. With Sonny Liston's life, we spoke about this previously, that it wasn't anything out of the ordinary for him, because he'd go missing for days at a time. He'd go away for these dirty weekends with his ladies of the night and end up with kids being plonked on his dinner table in restaurants. Geraldine had become a little bit worried by this because it's not the norm. It's gone a bit past the norm for her, so she decided to leave her family to come home. Now, when she returns home, she opens the door. The smell is absolutely horrible. So she decides, you know what, I'm going to have a little investigate around the house. You know, Sonny was always prone to putting stuff on the hob and leaving it there and burning his food. And she goes and checks it out. He's not burnt any food. The smell's still there. What's going on here? She goes upstairs. She goes into the bedroom and she finds Sonny Liston slumped on the bed with his body in a completely terrible state of decomposition, which indicates that he'd been dead for quite a number of days at this point. It's at this point where the story becomes even sketchier. So she goes home to find her husband dead. Now, we know he's got a bit of an unsavoury life going on. We spoke about it through this whole episode, and we spoke about the connections and the cheating and everything that he's done, but she knew him. She knew what he was about. She knew that life, and she obviously accepted that life. But then she comes home and she finds him dead, slumped on the bed. And it's what happens next for me that becomes really, really questionable and sketchy.
It's a strange situation, because she rushes over to her friend's house who lives locally. Rather than ring the police, she actually calls a doctor. And then sometime between 10 and 11 p.m, they return to the house, and they still don't call the police. They actually spend the next sort of hour and a half to 2 hours where no one knows what happens. I mean, the only thing that anyone can suspect is that Geraldine spends most of that time cleaning up the house and getting rid of all the drugs, removing all the drugs from the house. And she knew that Sonny was obviously a dealer, so she hid all of his gear. And then even more bizarrely is that when the police did arrive at midnight and the doctor pronounced that Liston is dead, obviously, you know, he's been decomposing for the last 5 days, is that they actually find a small balloon of heroin in plain view in the kitchen. Now, if Geraldine's been in the house for the last hour and a half to 2 hours, getting rid of all of Liston's drugs, because, you know, back then even the Vegas police were, there was a statement saying that families did tend to do that when before they arrived at the scene, it would be about an hour or two before they would arrive from the moment they're found, because they're clearing the property to get rid of drugs. They don't want their family to be, they don't want it publicised that he's a drug dealer. So, but the one thing is weird is that if she's that adamant in getting rid of all the drugs, why on earth would she leave a small balloon of heroin in plain view in the kitchen? So that's a big question. Now, Sean Fell, who wrote the book about Sonny Liston and the murder of Sonny Liston, he come up with a great plausible explanation, and he was right. I mean, you mentioned it earlier, Sean. The Vegas police were clearly corrupt in areas, not throughout the whole of Vegas, but back then the police, they were quite savage, and they wanted a case closed quickly. So it would make sense for them to plant the heroin. Now, the reason why they would do that is because they would want a search warrant. Sonny was known to the police. He was known to be a bit of a drug dealer. So they could get a warrant to search the property. They were unsuccessful in finding anything. So Geraldine had clearly done her job and cleaned the property. But why on earth she would leave that balloon of heroin in plain view? It's obvious that it must have been planted. That was the situation. And apparently what the police say is that the death, or what they conclude as the death, was a heroin overdose.
So they say that it was a hot shot, which is like a cocktail of heroin. I can imagine it gives you an instant hit, and obviously it's a big dosage of heroin, which completely knocks you out. But the suspicions here was that he died of a heroin overdose, or many felt it was basically a fatal hot shot. Now, something that was quite interesting that I picked up on is that the mob, when they executed some of the people that they didn't like, it wasn't just a case of putting them in the river with cinder blocks tied to the feet and letting them swim with the fish. There was also a method of execution that apparently they used, which was to basically give someone an overdose, which was known as a heroin hotshot. Straight away, suspicions obviously arising from my perspective as to how this has gone down. Now, when there was a post-mortem done on his decomposed body, the coroner had actually decided that Sonny Liston had died of natural causes. His verdict was actually that there was fluid on the lungs, which attributes to Syndrome X, where the blood doesn't flow to the heart, resulting in cardiac arrest. Now, he does also find heroin metabolites in his blood, which is not by any means the main root cause of his death, but the body can actually generate these metabolites when in a terrible state of decomposition, which is what he was in at the time. And also, the Vegas police were very quick to give their verdicts of a heroin overdose as the cause of death. And because of all the shady dealings that had been going on and the affiliations to the tie, it was quite evident with all that circumstantial information that they wouldn't have wanted to go any deeper into this. They knew who he was, they knew what he was about, they knew who he was affiliated to, and straight away it's just, he's took an overdose and that's it. So that was the end of that for them. Now, it's interesting because there's obviously a few different bits of information that we can go through here and touch on that has been well documented and well spoken about in various different podcasts that have been put out there, in various books by Shauna Sale as well, which we spoke about in this episode. As one of the biggest theories about his death is that they say he took a heroin overdose, or was administered a heroin overdose, but it was actually later discovered that he was petrified of needles, Sonny Liston. So how could he have took this overdose if he was absolutely petrified of needles? Now, it was also spoke about by his dentist that when he went to the dentist, he wouldn't even have an anaesthetic because he was that petrified of needles, and he was basically saying to them, do whatever you need to do, I ain't having a needle. So why would he then go and give himself an overdose? Why would he commit suicide if that's the case? And these are a lot of questions that have obviously gone unanswered in this unsolved mystery. One of the things that have been theorised is that he was actually in a car accident a couple of weeks before, which explains why there were puncture holes in his body which were actually scabbed over. And after the body was inspected and evidence were collated, there was newspapers that were stacked outside the door. By the time obviously the police had got there and Geraldine had got back, there was a numerous amount of papers, and this is how they attributed roughly when he passed away. They concluded that he passed away somewhere around about New Year's Eve, the 31st of December 1970.
There's all kinds of speculation. The kindest speculation is that Sonny had got into shooting up heroin, maybe a little joy popping or something like that, and had taken a little bit too much and his heart had given out on him.
People say, well, he couldn't have done drugs. He was afraid of needles. Other people say, oh no, he was a drug addict.
He had a dentist, and the dentist was quoted in various columns that Sonny, the big bad Sonny Liston, was deathly afraid of needles.
He didn't even like to get shot. That was the only thing, And so I says, I don't think that he would let someone just put something to go through his veins.
One coroner at the autopsy said that he saw old needle tracks on Sonny's arm. If in fact he had old needle tracks in his arm, then that destroys the argument that Sonny could not have been a heroin addict because he was deathly afraid of needles.
The other school of thought is that Sonny was given a hot shot, an intentional overdose of heroin to kill him. Why? Well, there are some people saying that he was getting too big for his britches. He was trying to muscle in on some of the underground characters he was working for, getting too big for his britches, and they decided that this was the way to dispose of Sonny.
The most interesting part of all this is the amount of people that wanted Liston dead. There is a list of 6 suspects that have been questioned, and they all have the motive. We'll go through the suspects list, and then what we'll do is we'll probably be better off if we give our thoughts at the end of it. The fact that 6 suspects that wanted Liston dead is crazy, and it's crazy that he would have been hated by 6 people that much to want him dead. He blatantly was injected with heroin. I mean, that's my first initial thought. Moving on to the suspects then. So the most obvious suspects of the murder of Sonny Liston, when you look back on his life, are, so we're going to begin with a guy that we spoke about earlier, which was Earl Cage. Now, this was obviously the beautician by day and dealer by night. And after Cage's home was raided by the DEA and Las Vegas police, Cage apparently put out a contract to Sonny Liston's life because he was the only one not to get arrested. He felt he was a snitch, and that gave him motive. So I think that's a good one to start with, Earl Cage, and it does definitely give him motive. The other guy, which is also the second suspect, is Robert Chudnik, who was the famous jazz trumpet player known as Red Rodney. Now, Red Rodney felt that Liston had become a liability and untrustworthy following the raid of Earl Cage's house, along with the altercation Liston had with his son Mark. Both would have their reasons for wanting him out of the picture. So 2 very interesting suspects, and 2 that would probably be high on the list.
Now, another possible suspect on this list is Mo Dalitz. He was an American gangster, businessman and casino owner, a major figure who'd shaped Las Vegas in the 20th century. He was often referred to as Mr. Las Vegas. After bootlegging during the Prohibition, he turned his attention to gambling and operated illegal but protected casinos. He invested in the Desert Inn, but when the original builder of the resort, Wilbur Clark, ran out of money, Dalitz and the Cleveland Mayfield Road Gang, aka the Cleveland crime family, bailed him out. Clark remained the public face and the frontman of the resort. Dalitz quietly remained in the background as the real owner. Just before Liston's death, he apparently made a fist behind Dalitz's back. When he saw Liston do this, he responded by saying, "If you do hit me, then you better make sure you kill me. Otherwise, I will make one phone call and you will be dead in 24 hours. I mean, it's a little far-fetched to suspect Dalitz, but you don't really take these type of guys for idiots. And I'm pretty sure that there would have been plenty of other victims that have done much less than what Sonny Liston did.
Oh, there would have been a few, especially to an American gangster. There would have been people that would have died for far less than that. So it is a long shot, and one that probably I wouldn't necessarily say is the top of the list, but definitely worth mentioning. And why would fit the description of being a suspect. And the other one that I've got in here is Irving Ash Resnick. And Irving Ash Resnick was the Thunderbird Hotel and Casino operator in Las Vegas, which related to the New York mob. Now, Resnick was native of Brooklyn and actually played ball at the NYU in the 1950s. He was believed to have been involved in a point-shaving scandal at the school, but was never officially found guilty of anything. While growing up in New York City, Resnick made connections with the mafia. Resnick was rumoured to be tight with Charlie the Blade Torine, an affiliate of the Giovesi Luciano family, and very interestingly, an international heroin trafficker. Resnick had other ties in the sports world, most notably with basketball legend Wilt Chamberlain. Chamberlain was a regular guest with Resnick at Caesar's Palace back in 1968-69 season when Chamberlain performed Parole. I mean, again, a bit far-fetched, but Resnick was a guy that had connections in terms of international heroin trafficking. So whether he would have been involved, maybe not a suspect, but he could have, and ties and affiliates with some of the top gangster families around at the time.
It's also been alleged that, Resnick actually put a contract out on Liston's life, and this allegation actually came from a Las Vegas police informant known as Erwin Peters, aka P. Peters, in 1982. He gave evidence to the police saying that Resnick's contract was accepted and was actually carried out by Larry Gandy. Now, Gandy was a legendary undercover Las Vegas cop that went bent. He was famously responsible for arresting drug dealers on the west side of Vegas. Many dealers were always wary of being stung by undercover cops, so they would only deal to someone if they shoot up in front of them. What Gandy would do is somehow he'd actually switch the heroin of rock for maple syrup and shoot maple syrup into his veins instead to make them believe they actually had a legitimate junkie on their hands, which resulted in him capturing many criminals. Now, due to his deep involvement undercover, he became hooked on cocaine and started organising robberies with his informant, P. Peters. By this point, Gandy was off the force and working with Peters, but something happened between them and they fell out, resulting in Peters testifying against Gandy about their robberies and his apparent involvement in Liston's death. A sting operation was arranged after Peters' statement to catch Gandy red-handed in the middle of a robbery, which resulted in his arrest, but only for the robberies, as the Liston allegation was actually never investigated.
Very interesting, and Peters feared for his life when Gandy found out he had ratted him out, so he moved to Oregon. Ironically, he was actually found dead under mysterious circumstances himself. His death has been reported as an accidental carbon monoxide poisoning from fumes from a damaged car exhaust pipe, which sounds a little bit dodgy, and Sean Assell met with Gandy sometime later when writing his book after contacted him via Facebook. When Assell arrived, the first thing Gandy said was, "So, you want to know if I killed Liston?" After several hours of discussion, Gandy said he didn't kill Liston, but he thinks that it was Earl Cage. So they all sort of, Gandy and Peters and Resnick, they all sort of link in somewhere along the line, and whether, although you're looking at three different suspects, I mean, the possibility is that one of them, if not all of them, knew who and how Sonny Liston did eventually die.
So the last and final suspect is Dale Klein, aka James J. Wojcik, who had been in and out of jail half his life and was actually on the FBI's most wanted list, and a fugitive who had been on the lam for 5 years after a Texas jailbreak. Also a mob hitman that admitted he helped kill Liston via an enforced heroin overdose, a popular mob execution technique. He is the only suspect that has actually admitted to the murder of Sonny Liston. He explained to his son, Greg Swarm, the role he played in both Liston's death and that of a showgirl who had wed a Texas oilman, depriving his family of a handsome inheritance, another enforced overdose. Klein had also told Greg of the existence of a movie script that would explain all. Now, following Klein's death in 1997, the son, Greg Swarm, flew to Los Angeles to retrieve his personal effects. He ran across the business card of a movie producer who turned out to be a mob insider connected to Sinatra. The producer insisted, "Let it lie. Too many people are still alive who won't want you to know about this. Your life will be in danger."
Well, incredible, isn't it? I mean, we've run through it. They are certain individuals that we believe were either involved or knew about the death of Sonny Liston, and was it an overdose or was he actually, did someone take his life with a shot of heroin? Now, for me, I mean, I will say straight up that for me, he was murdered. I honestly believe it. I think there's too much evidence to suggest that it was just a straight up suicide. And why would he sort of kill himself? It didn't quite make sense. In terms of who it was, I'm sort of tied with Wojcik because he actually admitted it, or whether Resnick took out a contract and maybe asked someone to do it, or whether it was Gandy. Or it's really troubling to think that so many people wanted Sonny Liston dead. It just doesn't make sense. But he was involved with some of the worst people around at the time. I really don't know. I mean, what are your thoughts, Sean?
I think as we've gone through the course of the episode and discussed all these certain characters in detail and the interactions Liston had with them all at some point or another, it's quite obvious that for the majority of the suspects on that list, they all had a genuine motive as to why Sonny Liston shouldn't be around anymore. As we've covered in the episode, he become quite a bit of a loose cannon. If he was a mob boss, he would be a loose cannon. He would be a guy with loose lips. He would be someone who could eventually blow the lid on everything that they were doing behind the scenes. So I can totally understand from their perspective why they'd probably want to get rid of someone like that. However, in the same sense, it's quite shocking to know that so many people wanted the guy dead. And through the course of this episode, we've covered his tough upbringing. The guy just wanted to be loved by people. And yeah, by the end of his life, he was hated by a hell of a lot of people, so much so that I believe someone did murder him. I do genuinely believe that. There's too much consequential circumstances surrounding everything for me that leads me to believe that he was murdered. There's no way the guy committed suicide in my eyes. From everything I've heard, from all the information we've brought out to this episode, from all the information from various sources of people that have done the research previously to us, there's too much information that leads me to believe that he was murdered and this wasn't suicide. The biggest thing was the needle story that we was telling people about earlier, the fact that he didn't like needles. The guy never liked needles, he hated them. Why would he then go to commit suicide by putting a needle in his arm and shooting himself up with heroin? It just absolutely doesn't make sense. So for me personally, I couldn't really put my finger onto who committed the crime, but I do believe that crime was committed, and I do believe Sonny Liston was murdered.
I mean, the fact he was involved with so many guys, unsavvy fellas that were linked with mafia and they had ties in the mafia, and you know, the last thing they needed was certain things being leaked, and it's difficult to, any one of them could have easily have done it themselves, or they could have put a contract out on him. I believe that would have been the case. I believe someone somewhere decided they've had enough of him, they're going to put a contract on him, and it's just a matter of who did it. I'm sort of tempted to say that Wojak is probably the guy for me that probably would do it, because he actually said he said he did it to his own son. Why would you say that in a boozer? And why his son wouldn't just come out and say it? Surely, I mean, it wouldn't make sense. So I believe a contract was put out, and I believe he probably took it, either that or someone else did. But definitely, you know, the fact that the needle thing is almost, he was petrified. He spoke about the story of him being so scared. He was like a little boy, wasn't he? He was shivering and scared of a needle when he was about to be administered a few years before that. So when he was young. So for me, 100% a contract was put out. He was definitely murdered. It was definitely not. He wouldn't have done it himself. And it's just incredible that he went this way. I mean, it's just following and investigating this story is just tragic and just upsetting for a guy that just wanted to be loved.
That is the truly sad part about it. I feel like we've gone through a roller coaster of emotions with this particular episode, and the inaugural episode for The Darker Side of Boxing. There was no other episode we could have started with than the mysterious life and death of Sonny Liston, because this was a guy that brought so much mystique to the sport. People theorise about what this guy would have been like in different areas of time, or what would he have done should his life not taken the turn it took. There's so many different things that you could attribute to what he could have done, but unfortunately his life took a turn for the worst, and eventually, well, as we believe, he was murdered, and it wasn't a suicide as reported. So many suspicious circumstances, but it's been a bit of a enthralling tale to go through for the first episode of The Darker Side of Boxing. I hope that all the fans that have been listening to all our other podcasts that may have jumped over to start listening to this one, I hope you've really enjoyed it. I really do hope you've genuinely enjoyed this. We've been working on this podcast for a little while now, wanting to get this out to the audience, and it's took months of research and gathering information and books and various different sources to put all these episodes together. So we really hope you do enjoy the series that we're running. We hope you've enjoyed this first episode, and we'd absolutely love it if you'd go and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts and a review of the particular podcast, and start spreading the word about The Darker Side of Boxing, a true crime based boxing podcast. If you want to follow us and check out all the latest comings and goings with the darker side of boxing, you can find us on Twitter at darker_side_pod, or we'll also be posting out on our Facebook page for the main podcast network, which is BTR Boxing Podcast. Please go and check out all the latest episodes of all the other series that we run, including Legendary Nights and Career Profiles, and the main BTR Boxing Podcast feed as well. We really hope that you've enjoyed the first episode, the mysterious life and death of Sonny Liston on the darker side of boxing.